It's good to see you all. I'm glad to see so many of you on this next iteration of our Humphrey School Summer Seminar Series. We'll be talking about the work of the Future Services Institute today, and I'm really pleased that we have two leaders of the Institute and a student who has been very, very engaged. Sook Jin Ong is with us, Henriët Hendriks, and we're really pleased to have Suriya Vijayasarathy with us to moderate the session. And you will see that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your link where you can pose questions, and Suriya, I'm assuming, will be moderating some of those questions and making time for this towards the end of the hour today. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Suriya, and I am going to mute my audio and listen eagerly to this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So I want to introduce our two panelists. Just going to read out a little bit of their bios. So first up, Sook Jin Ong is the director of the Future Services Institute, a new initiative of the Public and Nonprofit Leadership Center. And in this role, she really brings her interest and practice in blending human-centered design and participatory leadership principles to be of service to those in human services. Sook Jin, welcome. Also joining us is Henriët Hendriks. Henriët is the Research and Evaluation Director of the Future Services Institute. She is committed to bringing together academic research and real-world challenges in human services delivery and to strive for meaningful and mutually beneficial collaboration between universities and state and local governments. Henriët, welcome.
Thank you.
So as we get started, I just was hoping that both of you could kind of give everyone a little bit of context for what the Future Services Institute, FSI, does, and a little bit of a little overview of the work that you all do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Suriya. And once again, it's just such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I mean, holy moly, 128 attendees. That's amazing. So, you know, and also it's just really lovely to have this conversation be moderated by Suriya. Suriya has been with the Future Services Institute for the last 1 year, doing, you know, a lot of work with us, and as an emerging leader in this space, I'm sure you got good questions for us, so I'm really excited for that as well. So just a little snapshot for those of you who are not familiar with the work of the Future Services Institute. We have been here for the 4 years now at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, really coming from a space of how do we leverage the, you know, kind of knowledge, experiences, perspectives that we can offer from the university and from the Humphrey School to really serve the needs of the human services sector. So a lot of the work that we do cuts across the, you know, state agency level, the local government level, and also nonprofits, you know, working closely with foundations and whatnot to really see how do we try and improve services, policies, and all the work that goes into making human services a field that really serves the needs of families and communities out there in Minnesota. And so much of, you know, what all these organizations want to do better, a lot of it could be at their organizational level, and also that cuts across, you know, your organizations across silos at that systemic level. So we try and do that in either close partnerships. So we have quite a number of projects with the Minnesota Department of Human Services, different counties, different nonprofits out there. We have leadership development programs as well, you know, ones as rigorous as the Human Services Leadership Certificate, all the way to, you know, leadership programs that are more cohort-based around equity, around trainings on engagement with communities out there, and then also research and evaluation work that we do closely with our partners to help them do better. So this is kind of the work that we do in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, I think Sook Jin just kind of described it really well. I don't have much to add, but if there's kind of specific questions that the audience has, we can certainly address those, I think.
Well, thank you for that, both of you. FSI does a lot of stuff, and so it's kind of a good overview of what you all do and kind of provide that context for everyone. So let's really get into the heart of this. Would you all talk a little bit about COVID-19, this global pandemic that we're all dealing with, and how it's really heightened systemic inequities and racial injustice in the human services sector, and speak a little bit too of the challenges that the human service sector is facing in bridging these gaps?
I mean, it's a big question, right? I think as Sook Jin and I kind of thought a little bit about this before, right, this webinar started, one of the things we both really recognize is that we're still in it. We're in the midst of it, and so I think a question like this, like it's asking us to start making sense of that, right? Like, how has government responded? How have communities responded? And how do you do that when you're in the midst of a lot of that still? And so I think, but at the same time, a lot has happened. I mean, it feels, I think, the months feel almost kind of years if you think back to March and April. And I think both government and local communities and local organizations have really responded. So I think to your question of like, how has it widened disparities and inequities? I mean, I think we knew full well, everyone like in the human services sector was like that they existed in like all the places and in the human services before. And I think it's, I think there's a little bit of kind of a paradox that we're seeing right now, that at the same time where government and local communities are responding really quickly, and that it has some really benefits to it, such as changes in like requirements to access services or programs, or right, that a lot can happen online, that you don't have to be there in person. At the same time, that really lays bare the disparities that were present before in terms, say, of like access to technology. That's, I think, one thing we heard from our partners a lot, especially like local partners, that it's on the one hand great that we can move so much online, and at the same time, a lot of families don't have either the devices to do that or the access to reliable internet access. At the same time, it also takes still time and effort and knowledge about how to navigate all of that. So I think there's like this maybe things that we already knew before, that right, that there was an inequity in terms of access to technology. That is just one of the areas where I really see this heightened, and that has ripple effects, right? It's not just that, that means access to programs, to services. That means to be able to take care of your family, to get just the support you need in terms of food and housing. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So Jin, kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I think this is where, Suriya, you're framing, right? Like this is not new. For those of us who work in this sector, we know how, when anything, right, crisis, even on the, typical pre-pandemic day, a lot of these issues that, cause families and communities to turn towards human services, programs and policies for help, like it disproportionately affects our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color out there. And so when something like the pandemic happens, right, like we are just seeing that gap deepens. And when you think of, the work that gets impacted, right, folks that are out there, being the essential workers, so to speak, or ones that, end up losing their jobs first, like that's where the disproportionality kind of impacts, and then you see that show up in terms of the needs. So what I thought is also really encouraging is seeing how the local government, seeing nonprofits, even the state, responding in ways that, all right, we know that we're not going to get this right off the gate, but let's keep finding ways to listen to families. Let's keep finding ways to really hear and kind of manage that track of like listening, getting feedback, and at the same time implementing all these changes that were, you know, at one point just coming at such a rapid rate for those that were delivering services to try and manage the needs that were coming. So I think, you know, that the need is not lost on anyone that's in this sector. And I'm just really heartened that despite, you know, the way in which that, you know, folks have really jumped in and try and, you know, cater to that deep need, that, you know, at least through the partners that the Future Services Institute has, we're also seeing that thoughtfulness of like, all right, let's not just rush to the, you know, urgency of the moment. Let's make sure that where we had existing communication channels, where we had existing partnership, let's keep leveraging that, especially more so in moments like this. So I feel heartened by that. And I think this is where, you know, in the kind of work that we try to do, we try and make sure that relationships are the center point, right, of, you know, collaboration, of, you know, innovation. And I think more than ever, like, this really speaks to the importance of that. Like, just because we got a crisis doesn't mean that we need to stop communicating. In fact, it's more important than ever.
Yeah, there's so much to chew on with everything that you both talked about there, right? Like there's both the response by government, the response by community, and then that partnership in between as well. And looking at, you know, specifically looking at all these inequities, especially regards to Black, Indigenous, people of color that have always been there, that everyone has known has always been there, and are now being heightened and exacerbated by this pandemic. I wanted to jump on a little bit of something that you mentioned, Sook Jin, and Henriët, you mentioned this too, about this ability to, especially for government, to be nimble, to be able to respond to crisis. And government has a reputation a little bit for being slow, bureaucratic, and, you know, slow to change. But we have seen a certain agility from our government institutions in terms of responding. Two questions for you then. Why does it take a crisis to see that type of change? And going forward, are there ways for government to be more proactive rather than reactive and learn from this crisis?
Those are good questions. And I do wonder a little bit if it's the narratives, right, that we are exposed to. I think in many ways, well, I'll speak for myself, that, you know, I've been fortunate to work with some phenomenal partners at the local government level, at the state agency level. So we are, you know, like I'm exposed to folks that are doing the hard work, that are really trying to fight for these changes, right? Internally, you know, using whatever authority and leverage that they could get. So like, I hear those stories. And yet when we think about what's the narrative that's out there when it comes to governments and change and innovation, it's rare that you hear stories of things going well. Like, you know, we are so saturated with things not working, you know, complaints or like, oh yeah, there's this big mess up, right, that now, you know, government has to fix. And so I think, you know, it's important for, well, for us, you know, people that need to know what government is working on, to hear what some of those changes are, both to stay informed and also to inform the process as well. And so, you know, in ways in which that I have seen our public sector partners especially respond to this crisis, they are finding ways to hear that. I think, you know, there's also the piece where, because it's the pandemic and all of us are staying at home and, you know, glued to our cell phones and the computer, that, you know, our awareness of what the changes are heightens quite a bit. So hopefully that some of this, you know, changes around how folks are able to access programs and services, you know, gets to them sooner, gets to them quicker. Hopefully that they're hearing about some of these changes that makes a difference in their lives more quicker. And I think this goes to that second question that you asked around what could government do, right? Like, I feel like this is where, because, you know, for whatever reason, the pandemic has also caused some openings in terms of willingness for people to, you know, meet across the aisle, push through some changes that are immediately needed, that we don't take this as a one-off instance. Like, let's really treat this as, the starting point or progress in terms of the changes that would really serve the families and communities that we're trying to serve out there. Like, what if we treat all these waivers, policy changes, and whatnots as potential prototypes? What if we learn from that? And so I hope that, once we are not caught in that, heat of the moment, the crisis, so to speak, that we're able to pause and ask ourselves, like, what have we learned from seeing some of these changes put into place? And especially if our goal is to push for changes so that our programming, our policies are more racially just, if they pay attention to the inequities and address that, like, let's make sure we don't reverse on some of these changes that are making progress towards that direction. Like, what can we learn from this moment, really?
Yeah, I think I would echo all of that. And just kind of, I think, reflecting like what happens in a time of crisis. I've heard from like different kind of organizations, partners we work with, that it hasn't kind of narrowed their focus really on, I think, like on what really matters, which is serving families. And I think when for like local organizations, nonprofits, that's really nothing new, because they work with families and communities, right, directly all the time. But I think even for us sitting at the university, there's often kind of a layer in between, which is that kind of system. And so you hear stories, but often indirectly. And then I think about state government, there's even more layers. And I think what a crisis does is kind of strip that away a little bit, and like those systematic layers that you kind of otherwise get bound up into, like, well, there's this law, there's this policy that we first have to work with, rather than putting really what we call like the human-centered design, right? Like putting people first. And in a crisis, you can't but do that. I think that it brings the need, and I think just like it brings the stories, kind of what Sook Jin was saying, the personal stories are all around us. They're in the news, they come to us through our friends, our families, our neighbors, we see them. And so I think that we bring that then into our work too, and it kind of, I think all of us are more focused on that. And I thinking about like, so then all of a sudden some of these like things that were standing in the way before, like, well, we first have to go through this like level of leadership and get, approval for this, like all of a sudden it can happen faster. It's like, no, we can skip that step, or because we need to, in the moment, act fast. And so I'm thinking, what can we take with us right after? It is, I think, holding true to that, like no matter where you sit in the human services, to remind ourselves what it is all about, that it is about in the families. And that I think it's almost, I had to reflect a little bit, it's like when you get trained in the human services, when you come, at least for me, it's been true, like you come on the job, the first thing you almost learn is like how to navigate the system. You learn about the policies and the laws and the statutes and, right, like, and compliance and all of that, and reporting requirements. And then you learn about like why, like who this is served. And so kind of, can we reverse that, or at least really make that much more equal, where we continue to have the communities we're part of, we serve as front and center. And if not, if we're still, right, if at least much more equal, and not have this heavy tilt toward, I think, what this system is of government and this infrastructure that we're all working in.
It's like the human part of human services,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, yes, yeah, not just the, yeah, really hold on to that.
Yeah, we take that for granted sometimes, right? That's in the title.
Right.
You take for granted that, like, yes, of course we serve everyone, and that's kind of, we all are in agreement on that, and it's that I think that's true in principle, but to how do you really practice that? Not just in the time, I think, of crisis, when we maybe come together around kind of that, yeah, more easily, but also in just, I don't know, normal times.
Yeah, And Henriët, you mentioned human-centered design. That's something that we've talked a lot about. That's kind of part of the guiding ethic of FSI. Um, could you, and also Sook Jin, please feel free to jump in, give everyone a little bit of a just context for what that term really means, and means to FSI as well. And going off of that, how integrating human-centered design can really help to elevate the voices of people who experience human services on the ground, whether that's frontline workers, whether that's people with lived experience who with these systems. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of that?
I'm going to defer to Sook Jin because he's really the star of that.
Oh, you and I can do both. So that's a really great question. And, you know, this is where, so human-centered design in a nutshell is really how do you approach problem solving by involving those who are impacted by it as part of the process in a way that allows you to really learn more about the context with them, bearing in mind, you know, all the factors that would affect, you know, their involvement, right? So whether that's, you know, issues of equity or access or justice, like really factor that in, and then come up with an understanding of what's really the root problem that we're trying to get here. How might we, you know, leverage the different perspectives that are involved to come up with potential solutions or approaches to the problem, and then kind of test them out with, you know, smaller bite-sized approaches, and then learn from that and keep improving, right? And we really try and, you know, embody that in the way that we do our work with our partners, because we believe that, you know, you won't be able to solve the problem if you don't involve those who are at the heart of it, whether it's, you know, the families with lived experiences or persons with lived experiences who could tell you better than anyone what the points are that, you know, have caused them pain and harm, right? Or, you know, the frontline staff who are out there doing the hard work, like they are hearing the stories, they know where the roadblocks are. So if you don't listen to them, it's really hard to know what exactly it is that's required to solve the problem. And conversely, it's the same with, you know, those of us who are in positions of authority and power. Like, you know, it's easier to know what are the leverage points that you could, you know, move or shift if you know how policy works, if you know how to build a coalition of, you know, whoever it is that's necessary at the table. So it's like you need all these different perspectives at the table in order to get at what it really means to solve some of these issues, because they're just bigger than any one of us. Like we really need all of us to be a part of that problem solving.
Yeah, and I think how do we do that in practice? I think Sook Jin kind of touched, right? Like, and they've been kind of just reflecting on that a little bit, as much as you can reflect kind of in these times. Yeah. That it's real, and it goes to your question, Suriya, about like, you know, raising the voices. And I think for me, it means truly listening to all of the different voices and communities, and understanding that if I've heard one story from an individual or a community, that is not all, and that there is still many more out there. Like in some of the work with, like one project where I'm working closely with indigenous community, a tribal community, and learning too that, like, knowing kind of what they've faced, when their history and kind of the oppression they face and the racism they face, and at the same time, right, all of the beautiful strengths that they have as a community. Me knowing that does not tell me like necessarily anything about like other tribal communities within Minnesota or out, right? And that's all within like our drawn boundaries, kind of as Minnesota. Like that doesn't even stretch. Those boundaries are different too. And so I think recognizing that, like, to to put it in practice means to commit, I think, a lot of time and presence on the part of government. And I think it's not just or only about raising voices, it's also making true space for voices. And I think that means at times, and maybe a lot for government officials and experts and also university officials and experts to kind of step back intentionally to create that space, and not just as a, okay, we'll listen and then we'll kind of continue, but to truly be present for the long term. That is not an one-time listening session. I think a lot of like know us that kind of that's this is an ongoing conversation, but to be as if you truly practice it, I think as I understand this, like that we're there for the conversation for the long term, and we're willing to sit and to listen and to act on what we hear and have a commitment to that. And it might not look like what we had intentionally or set out to do and act on. We might have to shift, but to act, to have that commitment to listen and to act, and to
just kind of build off on that, I think what Henriët say is so important, because like we cannot presume that we know what the best ways are to engage folks either, right? I think that this is where, oftentimes in some of the best partnerships that we have been in, that it's truly collaborative. It's truly, like how we can learn from those that we partner with, and they bring with them, like their understanding of the people that they're with, the relationships that they have, and what it really means to hear from each other and from those that, we're trying to engage with. And that also means that, we are constantly kind of collectively building that ability to hold that space for each other. Because there are times when, like let's just be real about, what it means for each of us individually and the organizations that we're with and all that to be in a space. It changes dynamic. It changes, how we listen and what we're listening to. And so the ability to have, these genuine conversations to make sure that, we're understanding and that we are making sense together, then helps us to get closer to what is it that we're trying to solve for. And I think especially in times right now, with COVID-19, with the uprising that we saw after George Floyd's murder, like, we have to constantly learn and be fine with not knowing, be fine with being uncomfortable, be fine with like, yes, I do not know what I don't know. And this is why we have a partnership, and this is why we learn from each other. And, the more that we create that space to learn, to do, to just be, then that really helps us to get to, approaches or solutions that are more meaningful.
Yeah, I really want to put a pin in like that particular topic around knowledge and what community knows versus government or institutions might know, especially when it comes to people with lived experience. We do have a great question from the audience, and really going back to what Henriët said about putting it in practice, putting action behind the words, and that's something that we talk a lot about. In the county, we just, the Hennepin County just declared racism as a public health crisis. And, the next steps are really action steps towards, combating that. So they're trying to put actions behind the words that people are saying. So the question really comes in, what are the best practices and ways to listen and engage? The audience member who submitted the question really gave the example of CARES funding, and mentioned that in COVID, it's really difficult to connect in person, to engage in broader communication or community town halls. So what are some good ideas, examples, best practices that you've seen like really put in practice in your work and some of your perspectives?
That's a great question. This brings to mind this one example that, well, actually similar examples, but particularly this one example from a partner of ours where they really leverage their fellow organizations, like other people that they have in their collaboration to do some of the engagement. So they had wanted to learn about how, you know, families are coping with what's going on in the ground during COVID, right? So they have a couple of questions that they were really interested in, and they shared that among several partner organizations, and like, hey, if you could survey people or talk to people about this, it'll be really great. And what the partner organizations then do is, in, you know, their case consults or, you know, opportunities that they would have to reach out and talk to the families anyway, be like, hey, you know, could we spend some time to really learn about how are you navigating now, right? And so the main organization that was coordinating this was only expecting like 20, 25 responses max, but in the end they got more than 100. And that was because the little bit of work that, you know, each and every partner organizations were taking on that resulted in that snowballing, right, of, you know, like more responses coming in. So here, you know, like, and I've also seen other examples shared by, you know, either students or partners where when they leverage the relationships that they have and really work with them, because these are also questions that these organizations are interested in themselves, right? So what are some ways that we could look at the partnerships that we have with new eyes, with new perspectives? How could you reach out to your partners and be like, hey, I'm interested in learning about this. Are you as well? Let's, you know, try and find avenues that are already there to build this engagement. Because I feel like, you know, especially during times of COVID, if you're trying to build new relationship, it's pretty hard given the kind of constraints that we have. But it doesn't mean that you cannot let, you know, like, really use existing relationships that you have to be these spaces to listen. So I often encourage people to at least start with who you know, start with folks that you know, and, you know, find ways to make sure that you pay attention to, well, where they are as well, because it might not be the right time to engage them, and that's okay. But at least ask, because you never know.
Yeah, I'd say yes to kind of like everything that Sook Jin just said, and it kind of thinking of it to more from like the evaluation perspective. We have this one project that we started March 1st, and so we had one meeting in person with just one kind of our main contact person at this organization, and then COVID-19 happened, and so we had to build all of our relationships online, and it's been hard, and I think we really had to let go a little bit of like what we had intended to do and not kind of chase that and think, right, we can just put everything kind of what we had online and just go with that, because it simply doesn't work that way. I think to do like a lot of the work we do, like relationships and trust are key. I think as an evaluator, you can ask questions if you don't have the trust that like how you and that you will use this, or you kind of, yeah, whether you use the information or what you will do with it in a way that you can be kind of open and transparent about, and also circle back. It's like you might get an answer, but it might really not be the answer to the question you're asking. And so like how that was, I think, a real challenge, to kind of let go of kind of, you know, the in-person relationship building we would do had to happen online, and that just took a lot longer, and really, you know, giving space for that. So in that, like we always start off, I think this is a practice in our within our own team, but with a lot of the partner meetings we have with our partners too, is with a check-in question. And so just and you can do it in multiple ways. Like if you have a really big group, you can have people just add some questions in the chat. You can have a Google document where people type up, or just kind of go around if it's a smaller group. And sometimes they're pretty heavy, and sometimes they're pretty meaty check-in questions where you're asked. I think people like, you know, share something maybe more personal, but sometimes it's very light too, like the kind of conversations you would otherwise have before you start a meeting. Because I think what's hard with these online, we dive into a lot of deep things immediately, when we do the kind of engagement, and that is just difficult, I think, for all of us. And so starting off with like, I don't know, what did you like? We just shared kind of like, yeah, favorite books and podcasts and movies, or what puts a smile on your face when you're in the last couple of days. And so I think that relationship building and the trust is so key in this work to keep engaging with each other, whether that be like within an organization, and then also starting that with or continue that with families and communities. And to keep doing that, finding ways to do that, I think, through the online platforms as well. And then also what Sook Jin was saying, like thinking about really creatively about different ways. Like we did the same what Sook Jin was saying about, working with partner organizations, like with this evaluation, we were kind of like, we can't go in and just randomly email and call people who have no idea who we are. So we formed kind of a learning team within the organization. So staff who are already there know the organization really well, and they do interviews, like just short interviews with different staff and different organizations. And then that snowballs. And what they're learning, it's not just that they get information back about the project, but they're also building new connections through that. So it's and that helps, right? Whether I think that will help as we stay online. It also will help when we come back in some ways together, that we continue to think like, how do we build that with all of the limitations that we have and all of the challenges we face.
Mm-hmm. Can I tie that to a question that popped out from an attendee? So one of you asked about how your county has 2.5 million to spend towards CARES between July and December 1st. And it's that mix between the urgency, right? Like you gotta get the money out, you gotta get it out the door, and engaging and collaborating and conversations take time, yet alone the fact that everyone is stretched. Like I think that is such a good thing to bring up, because we have to be real about that. One thing that not to say that this is the answer to that question, one thing that we have seen repeatedly in the different projects and partnerships that we're on is to actually have that frank conversation. Be like, let's be real. Like you all are busy. You all are, just really stretched, working extra hours. There's all these things on our collective plates. And there are, whatever the opportunities, right? In this case, the CARES funding. So then really kind of have that conversation around prioritizing, conversation around like, okay, what are some of the steps that we need or conversations that needed to be had? And when can we get to it? And are we, like, will we be able to leverage other ways of being together, right? Whether it's a subset of us that have the conversation and then float it with the larger group to work on things. Or, there may be like, okay, let's try and have this conversation by then. And before that, there's all these homework that each of us need to do before we get to that conversation. So like kind of finding other configurations so that you still get to hear from, as many different voices, or at least from different groups, so that you're not just stuck with only one way of, say, spending the money or meeting the needs that are needed. But at the same time, just kind of respect where everyone is at with regards to, just how stretched folks are, right? Because I think, it's one thing to be like, yeah, we're all stretched. And then there's also the, well, given this opportunity or given this thing that's coming up, I personally can say that I am able to spend this much time, or I'm able to clear my schedule during this time because this means a lot to me. And the best way to find out is to ask that question point blank.
Yeah, and I appreciate that answer. I think also going to the question as well, there's a lot of meat in this question, especially around the idea of collaboration. That we talk a lot about getting input, listening to community, listening to people across, divides, but it really comes down to how do we really integrate their input and experience into the work that we do. So what does it mean to really meaningfully collaborate? in the human services sector, especially with these limitations of physical distancing, technology? What does that look like for us now and going forward?
That's another great question. I think it's, right, collaboration is this I don't know if it's a buzzword or it's like, I mean, we all strive for true collaboration, because I think we have a strong feeling and belief that it's much better than the silos that we have. Let's say that, even like with, well, so, but then how do you do it in practice, right? You can't say like, okay, now let's bring together people and collaborate. Because I think as the audience member pointed out, to say when you're stretched, I think collaboration is about those partners, and then those partnership and the relationships. And they take a lot of energy and time. And even if they're pre-existing, it's like you still have to maintain them. You still have to invest in that. And so that's so hard. And I don't know if anyone is excelling at that right now. Like I don't hear that. I think it's difficult. It really is. I think what Sook Jin was saying about being really honest about that. And if you have that kind of the relationships before that allow you to do that, to say like, I simply can't do this, but I can do this part of it. And to then start pushing on like what makes it that it's hard to collaborate, right? It's oftentimes, I think, these deadlines, like with the CARES Act, right? You have to spend it in a certain amount of time, and I doubt it that we can push that more, but can we just be really honest that it's really difficult to do that? That I think at the same time, when a lot of money, and I've been hearing that, I think from different partners too, like at the same time, like a lot of this emergency funds and money is coming to government and then through government to local communities and organizations. Spending it actually can be quite difficult, because the way that it went out before COVID-19 you can't do it in the same way. And so it's, and then getting consensus on like how you're going to spend it, and then the budgets, right? It's much more difficult to do that all online. So as if we're really honest about that, and also to our funders, and say that, and I think if we collectively say that, I don't know if it changes anything, but there might be ways that, I think we've seen that with our DHS partners, that if we kind of are transparent and open about that, and we have an honest conversation, what we're hearing from local organizations, that they're like, oh, well, wait, let's just talk to our contract manager. Let's talk to legal and see what is possible. It might not all be possible. Maybe there's a little bit more flexibility, or at least I can connect you to another organization that's struggling with the same thing, and you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel or do it all on your own. And at the same time, I think it's difficult. It's just incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I want to tie a little bit back to the idea of communities as well. And we've talked a lot about government. Kind of from the more ground level, we have a great question about how are communities finding support and staying together through this distancing? What are some of the other, like community-based ad hoc things that are popping up that government needs to be aware of to be able to support and also to kind of allow to happen as community knows what's best for them?
That's a great question. I think like two of the questions from the audience kind of gets to that. I think this is where we have to remember that we are not just, employee of X organization, right? All of us are community members ourselves, we're parents or siblings, or, like we know people, we're neighbors, we're friends, we are in community ourselves. Like we cannot separate those roles all the time. And this is where, if folks are aware of a need if you're aware of a need in your your neighborhood, if you're aware of a need in your community, and like someone mentioned mutual aid or ad hoc efforts that have emerged, and we saw a lot of that, like when COVID was really ramping up, and then especially after the murder of George Floyd, like this is where it's like you have probably folks that know about it in your own organizations or in your own teams. And if you don't, you know, there are probably partners who are out there doing the work. So I think there's a little bit the onus on us to do some of those almost like information seeking or relationship, like just like knowing what's going on out there, and also be open with the fact that, you know, you're not going to know what to do immediately, what's the right thing to do, if you are even the right person to do it. I think to have that humility is important as well. And also be mindful, right, of the dynamic, like it was expressed in one of the questions, that, you know, there's issues of mistrust, for example, with different involvement, especially where government is involved. So know that it's going to take time. You know, be real about what you could do and what you couldn't do, and why are you engaging in the first place? Like, are you engaging because you genuinely could see that, yes, you know, there's a need and there are ways that we could provide resourcing, or, you know, our space or whatever that might be that you have to make this a mutual and beneficial relationship? Or are you doing it because you feel like, oh, if we don't do something, they're going to say something about this, or, you know, coming from a space of guilt instead? It's like, no, like really get to the heart of why do you want to do this? And how could you do this in a way that allows you to really show up and be real about, you know, what you could do and what you couldn't do in this space. So that comes to mind.
Yeah. I'm just gonna, I'm also seeing a couple of like these questions around like human services providers being really empty, depleted, burned out. And I just want to acknowledge that as like that. I think these two, like I hear that a lot. I feel it myself, and I can't even begin to think of, I think that was already true before COVID-19. I think our human services providers and frontline staff are just, they're like, I would say literally like day in, day out, and to support families and communities. And I think now it's more, and that's, I think the paradox again, right? There's, at the same time, there's more funding available, but not necessarily kind of more staff or organizations to do that work. And I think so that question too about how can new providers be developed and allowed into these funding opportunities, I think that just asking that question is so good to think of, like that we think about that. It kind of comes back to this, when I think about the crisis, we come together, but we also, I think, narrow our vision on kind of what's in place. And it's hard to think about new ways of doing or be creative, and to remind ourselves and our the people we work with, organizations we work with, to keep asking those questions, because we can do it all. And we know this is not just for the next couple of weeks or months, it's for the long haul. And so how do we support each other? I don't know, like, it's a good question about the funding opportunities or the resources that are out there.
One thing that comes to mind is there's this really gorgeous resource out there by Deepa Iyer, Deepayer. And she had this whole resource around understanding our roles in a social change kind of environment or ecosystem. And it's important for us to recognize that there are many different roles for us to play out there. And this is where, you know, like, what if all of us recognize, you know, where we are at with regards to our own roles, right? You know, what if, you know, we recognize that our role in the human services field is to serve, you know, social change, and it looks very different than the folks that are out there in the front lines. It looks very different than the healers and the teachers. It looks very different than the guides and the, you know, agitators. Like, all of us have different roles to play. So how might we think of the work that we're doing as part of, you know, pushing for change, even though it might look different from each other? and then really think about what, you know, self-care means in relation to that work, right? So not to think like, oh, because I'm doing my work, I'm not serving community needs. I'm like, no, we need you. You're doing important work. Like, please be there, you know? So how do we think about that differently? I think it's really key as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also this really good side of this question as well that came in around, you know, developing the providers and new funding opportunities. It's also this idea that there's a whole new crop of amazing talent that's coming up and leaders that are coming up. We're talking about young people. We're talking about existing, you know, organizations that are now finally getting their due because they've been doing the work for so long, and now finally they have a time to shine in this space. So what are some ways that the human services professionals, especially in government agencies, can lift up those new leaders, can provide more opportunities for them to, you know, get easier access to funding, to be able to provide them opportunities to be in the limelight and to do the work that they're really, really good at? What does that look like, and how do we do that?
I love that question. I think that all of us have a responsibility to think from a space of abundance. It's like, you know, if you know you have an upcoming opportunity, like, don't just share it with your usual networks, right? You know, like, share it beyond, like, who else? And then maybe even encourage those that you know to, you know, share it beyond. And also be real about the limitations of your network. It's like, who do you not know? And who potentially might know folks that are outside of your network, and, you know, like, encourage them to spread that word, right? Because I think, you know, right now, like, the question that was asked was so true. It's like, immediately we turn to those that we know immediately, and yet there's all these amazing folks out there that are doing work. So, like, what if we try, those of us who are in this sector, like, take it upon yourself, do that little bit of hard work, and, you know, really ask, like, who are you really reaching? Who are you not reaching? And how might you reach out, right? You know, like, be able to push that out and not just see that, you know, your existing channels are sufficient, because frankly, they're not. So, you know, like, we have to do the work to go beyond.
Yeah, and I want to kind of come back to like this, like, thinking creatively. I think at the same time we have extra funding, a lot of us are facing hiring freezes, which makes it, it's again that paradox of more work and more and people already being at capacity or over capacity and in existing roles and organizations. And so really kind of pushing to be creative as much as is possible. It just reminds me of an example of like a consortium of universities in the Midwest who are in a network, and there was some money through a foundation, and one of the questions, like, how do we best spend that? Is that through like a grant to a partnership with like university and nonprofit, or is it through supporting faculty to do research? Or with the third option, which we all kind of said, yes, do that, is like to just to look to further explore if you could hire someone, a recent graduate student from a public policy school to do work in the human services sector, and so to support them for like a couple of years. That's kind of a creative way to get around some of these hiring freezes. And then I think if you couple that with what Sook Jin says, is like, when you fill those, kind of think about these positions, and that, Suriya, what you brought up, like the leaders, to really think carefully then about like who are we considering here, and how do we really lift up people who've been doing this work for a long time in such important ways. So yeah, keep pushing, and if you can't find partners who are willing to do it, who maybe have a little bit more capacity to do it.
Yeah. To just in the interest of time, I know we only have a few minutes left, so we do have one more question in the chat that I will ask, and then we'll kind of roll it into kind of my last takeaway for you all. So kind of going back to this idea of, you know, burnout, you know, we're all kind of stretched thin, and kind of looking at, what would be the results if human service providers aren't able to get that support that they need? And maybe some more creative, to your point, Henriët, more creative ways for agencies to start distributing work, and new ways to kind of alleviate that strain.
It's a really good question. I wish I had kind of a better answer than thinking. I think it's kind of what Sook Jin, like at the same time where we have our different roles and with that comes responsibilities, and we don't have to do it all. At the same time, it's also letting go a little bit of some of roles for those of us who can. I think there's where maybe your role was to be kind of, for me, like an evaluator, but it doesn't mean like I hold on to that very tight when the need is more to bring people together or to support in that way. And so I mean, I don't have a much better answer to that, and I wish I did. I am happy to think about it more too and share it.
Yeah, and I'll kind of follow up with that really quickly. I think there is going to be continuous support, at least when we're looking at it, upstream or downstream, so to speak, for like funding and whatnots. Like, I think people are recognizing how hard this moment in time happens to be. But at the same time, we are also facing, well, just the reality, right? Like downsizing, freezing of hiring, funders that may be flexible for now, but may not re-up their commitment down the line. So I think that's still kind of playing out, and hopefully that, we're all able to kind of pay attention, see what's coming, and share that with each other. So I think there may be some, I don't know, just really being able to share the story of your work, share the story of the work that is being done by your partners, and share the story of the community. I think the more that, we're able to be real about what it is that we're collectively facing, the more that, whoever that's going to be doing and paying attention to the resourcing part, that they're able to get those information and really come to advocate together. Like some of the things that I've seen happening are the results of collective push or collective advocacy. So I know times are hard to collaborate, and like let's be creative about that, with whatever constraints that's real for you.
Awesome. Well, I just want to quickly, in the last minute or two that we have, ask you all, if people want to know more about FSI, the work that you all doing, projects that are kind of coming up, where can they go to find more information?
Our website. It's the best way to find us. Reach out to us, and I'm sure that after this, for those of you who sign up for this webinar, you'll be getting the recordings and whatnot. That's another way to reach out to us as well.
Yes, and find us, I would say, reach out to us personally too. I think it just, we're facing, all of us facing enormous challenges, and also in many unique ways. And so I think not having always the answers might not mean that there's other people who do. And so connecting you, I think we have a great network of amazing partners who might have had the answers to some of the questions that were raised here. And so I think we would do anything we can to connect, to make those, to start those relationships, however that's helpful.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you, both of you, for your insight, all the work that FSI is doing. It's incredible. I certainly encourage everyone who is on the call to learn more about FSI and look at the website. This discussion will also be posted on YouTube on Tuesday. You should be able to get a link to that. And I just want to say, thank you to everyone who signed on and listened. I hope you found this conversation to be inspiring and informational. And also as a reminder that the Humphrey School Summer Seminar Series, it's a tongue twister, it will continue to next Thursday. Next Thursday, tune in at noon. The conversation will be with Assistant Professors Gabe Chan and Bonnie Keeler, and 2020 STEP graduate Maggie Rogers. And they're going to be talking about environment and energy in times of civil unrest. To everyone out there, stay safe, stay well, stay activated. Thank you so much for coming on and listening, and have a great weekend, and happy 4th, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Everyone.